moderate that. But with that, Dr. Clay Blomberg, thank you for joining us.
Testing, testing. This is cool. When I teach in large rooms, we have 2 screens, and I discovered when we first started doing it a number of years ago, I was used to talking to people in front of me. And then nobody sat there anymore. And they were all here or here. Now, I'm not sure if it's because this is a right-wing audience from your point of view, but there's nobody. But you guys will give this screen a little TLC. That's good. Well, thank you for this invitation. I'm actually going to try to end around 8. An hour sounds daunting. Maybe 50 minutes sounds better. So we'll have a good half hour or so for whatever your questions are. There were days, years, decades, when I would have to give an introduction about why this is an important topic. When I was growing up, things like you'd hear someone say, I swear on a stack of Holy Bibles that something is true. I haven't heard that in a long time. And I can imagine somebody saying, well, so what? So you swear on a bunch of Bibles. What's the Bible say? Is it true? I heard people use expressions like, it's the gospel truth. I haven't heard that one in a while either. And you're right, the internet, you know better than I do. I suspect your screen time, I spend a lot of time online. It might be higher than mine. I almost want to say, right now in your mind, don't shout it out, just think of the most absurd thing you could invent on anything. And you might be able to find somebody who believes it online. And we don't have the checks and balances for good and for ill that we had before, so we have to become savvy. We have to learn how to check independent testimony. And it's something like that with the Gospels as well. I have a little magnet on my refrigerator that a friend sent me a number of years ago, and it's got a picture drawn like the typical Caucasian Jesus that he wasn't. Sitting with a bunch of people around some rocks, and the caption says, now pay careful attention. I don't want there to be 4 versions of this circulating. Well, too late. I already have them. Can we say anything? And for those of you who are Christians, I need to be honest. I'm going to take off my Christian hat for the next number of minutes. Would somebody make sure I put it back on before I leave the room? But oh, you can't see it? Well, yeah, it's there. And try to function like a historian of the ancient world, particularly the ancient Near and Middle East, or what some people call the ancient Mediterranean world, the Roman Empire, and use the kind of arguments and criteria and ask the questions that people ask routinely about other ancient sources. How do the Gospels fare if we do that? We start by reminding ourselves that what we were talking about back then didn't look like one of these. Whether hard copy or digital. It didn't look like the insides either. The oldest known fragment of any part of the New Testament that we have happens to be a bit of the Gospel of John, chapter 18. Ironically, in the passage where Pilate says, "What is truth?" And it looks like that. If you study a little bit of Greek, you might recognize some of the Greek capital letters that are there. You might recognize that occasionally it looks like there's a dot or a space, but mostly people just wrote in consecutive, parallel, straight lines till they hit a margin. They kept on going. There was no spacing between letters or words. There was no distinguishing capital and lowercase letters. There was no punctuation. There were no quotation marks or any felt need for them. There were no footnotes, no maps, no pictures, no dedication pages, or anything that we tend to think of. By the time we get up into this was from the very early 2nd century. By the time we get closer to the end of the 2nd century, we begin to see more or less complete Gospels. And again, if you go to a Greek group, turn to your sword, you might recognize your letters up there somewhere, so you can read any of it or not. This is what scholars have to make sense of when they go to ancient manuscripts. Eventually, from about the 6th century onward, you began to get the development of lowercase letters, some breathing marks above letters, some accent marks, the occasional punctuation mark, but it still looks an awful lot like words just run together. And I could have made a PowerPoint out of this, but I still like writing things spontaneously. Somebody says, "How could anybody ever read that?" Well, you're probably don't know Greek. I mean, how could anybody read that? But if you know English, you can start to figure things out, and I'll stop there. The science and art of doing our best with thousands of ancient manuscripts to reconstruct the most probable original is called textual criticism. There are massive reasons for believing that we come very, very close to the original, even in modern language translations, with both Testaments, but especially with the New Testament. When we observe the facts such as there are only 2 occasions, interestingly both in the Gospels, where some manuscripts differ from others in terms of having or not having an entire passage or self-contained story. The longer ending of the Gospel of Mark that actually contains resurrection appearances and the story of the woman caught in adultery when Jesus refuses to condemn her and says, "Go and sin no more," that spans John 7 and 8. And we can look at the evidence and see that it's probably good that Mark didn't write what we call Mark 16:9-20, because among other things it says you can pick up deadly snakes and drink their venom and you won't be harmed. I've never tried that, and I have no intention of starting that. My parents did. The story of the woman caught in adultery may well be a true story. A lot of people think it is, including some very skeptical ones, but For various reasons, it's not something John originally wrote. Other than that, there are only a couple of dozen textual variants, places where a manuscript has something that others don't, and vice versa, that are even 1 to 2 verses in length. And hopefully, even if you read the Bible on a phone, all of the versions you can get are made so that you can look up, you have to click on something, footnotes that will tell you when there are variants like this. You can see them for yourselves. We have over 5,700 Greek manuscripts of portions of a book all the way to an entire New Testament before the printing press was ever invented in the 1400s, allowing standardization of texts. And we have found so many differences, most of them spelling, use or non-use of a conjunction, and, or, but, an article, the, word order where it doesn't really affect the meaning, and then a few hundred more interesting but still very small differences. The important ones you can read about in the footnotes or marginal notes of modern language translation. If somebody occasionally says there were to be a spectacular discovery of a demonstrably first century document that had something in one of the books that wasn't in anything else, oh, you'd have a few sensationalists making a lot of currency out of it, but serious scholars would say, all right, let's figure out how some scribe added that in. Because if there is no evidence for it anywhere in the thousands of other texts that we have, there's no conceivable way it could have been original. The only reasonable explanation is somebody added it in. Well, can we figure out why and how? Over 99% of the text can be reconstructed beyond any serious doubt, and there is no tenets, no doctrine, no ethical teaching of Christianity that depends solely on a disputed text. There's a delightful textual variant in 1 John chapter 4 that spans a couple verses that somewhere about the 14th century somebody added a reference to the Trinity and made it in the King James Bible, and it hasn't been in any Bible after that to speak of. And modern supporters of the King James are constantly accusing other Christians of having left out the Trinity from the Bible. Well, A, no, they didn't leave anything out. They went back to the originals and found it wasn't there. And B, there are dozens of other places that it depends on the doctrine of the Trinity. You don't have to have that one. So let's represent things accurately. Now, I have met Christians for whom this one argument almost sounds like it's enough to convince them. And that gets me worried. What does the ability to accurately reconstruct an original text accomplish? Tells you we know what the gospel writer said. It doesn't tell you a word about whether it's true or not. If G.K. Chesterton or C.S. Lewis had lived in the 13th century and written the famous novels, made the movies that they made, it wouldn't turn fiction into history. It would just let you know we know what it was they said. So we have to move on from there and ask things like, do we know who wrote these books? The unbroken claim of the church for 18 centuries was And in chronological order of their composition, probably Mark, then Luke, then Matthew, and then John. Mark appearing on the pages of the New Testament as a somewhat obscure character, companion of both Peter and Paul, may be best remembered for when he deserted Paul and Barnabas on their first missionary journey. Hate to be remembered for that one lapse. They are later reconciled, hallelujah. Luke, even more obscure, he appears at the end of a couple of Paul's letters among people that Paul greets. Believed to be the voice behind the times in the book of Acts, when the third person narrative, Peter did this, and Barnabas did that, and Paul did this, and they got this response, suddenly shifts into first person plural narrative. And then we embarked on the boat and sailed to such and such a place. And we did this. Paul calls him in older English his beloved physician, his really well-liked doctor. Matthew, a converted tax collector, and one of the 12 apostles, but tax collectors in person working for the Roman government. If you watch The Chosen, I love the way they portray Matthew there. I have no idea if it's accurate, but I like it anyway. It is interesting. People on the spectrum, as we would call it today, as I think Matthew is supposed to be being portrayed, were often very stigmatized in ancient Judaism. They might think they didn't have as much to lose to go and work for Rome. Interesting possibility. But it means that if I were making up the name of some early Christian that I wanted to falsely attribute a gospel to, I'm not going to pick Mark, he's too obscure, or Luke for the same reason. I'm definitely not going to pick Judas, who betrayed Jesus. But after that, Matthew might be the next least likely person that I would pick. Only the fourth gospel, only the Gospel of John, written by someone called the disciple that Jesus particularly loved, one of the inner group of three of the lead apostles, along with Peter and James, would have been a natural choice in such a context. People doubt these ascriptions in various scholarly circles. That's an interesting conversation to have if we had a few more hours. But the important point is, even if those doubts are correct, then the reason they got these names is most likely because somebody who was a disciple or follower of Mark, or Luke, or Matthew, or John was the true author, and that only moves you one more person, one degree of separation further from the original events. By ancient standards, this is incredibly fortunate evidence. What about David? No, not the kind some of you are hoping for. Maybe. But when were the four Gospels written? Here I put up two columns. I put up a conservative column that would be pretty typical for evangelical Christian scholars. Mark in the late 50s or early 60s, Matthew and Luke also in the early to mid 60s, John perhaps in the late 80s to 90s. And then if you go to less conservative, more liberal circles, you will see Mark perhaps in the late 60s or early 70s, Matthew and Luke in the 80s, maybe even in the 90s, and John probably in the 90s. And if you wanted to stay another few hours, but you don't, we could have that debate. But what's interesting, again, is what those two columns have in common. Jesus most likely crucified in the year 30. We are talking about 1 to 2 generations at most on anybody's dating. And yes, there are some outliers. There are always outliers. But these are the most common dates in 2 camps. When we look at, say, the life of Alexander the Great, who, by the time he died in 323 BC, had conquered more of the known Middle East than anybody previously. And he didn't quite make it to his 33rd birthday. Didn't live as long as he had to do stuff faster. The earliest reliable biographers we have of Alexander the Great are Plutarch, Arian, late 1st, early 2nd century AD, more than 400 years after the events described. And yet, textbooks of world civilization routinely cite what they have in common, and they have a lot in common, and they cite sources that they consulted as what we can trust. If it fits the customs, if it fits the time and the place, it's what we have. There isn't any reason for reasonable doubt. This is a short period of time. But maybe somebody is thinking, I jumped the gun. Have I presupposed what I should have been defended? That the genre or intention of these documents seems to be historical in the first place? What if they were historical fiction? You know the genre. Something that is carefully researched so that all the times and places and some of the people and the customs and the practices are true to that period, but then you have a few main characters and you tell a fictional story about them. Trouble is, we're not aware that that literary genre was even invented until about the 18th century. We don't have other examples of it. Now, we do have examples of pretty much pure fiction, stories told, located in maybe Israel or Greece or Rome, and there might be a city or two or a place name that's recognizable, but most of the people and most of the place names will be made up, transparently so, as a way to tip the readers off that this is fiction. We don't get that with the 4 Gospels. But someone will say, didn't a bunch of Jesus' followers think that based on one way to interpret some of his predictions, that the world might end in their lifetime? Yeah, it's true. Some of them did. You read about them in the Thessalonians, other places. Well, if the end of the world might be coming soon, you're not going to worry about writing history of this new movement you're a part of, are you? Very hard to answer the question, what do you do in a certain situation? You ever had a friend try to guess what you do and guess wrong? We actually know there were a group of Jews out of a sect called the Essenes that lived in a monastic community on the shores of the Dead Sea. Their writings were discovered after World War II. They came to be known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. They believed every bit as much as some early Christians that the world was going to end in the middle of the 1st century. And they kept track of their community since it was founded about 200 BC. Because you always have to hedge your bets. What if it's delayed? What if you're wrong? What if you didn't interpret it rightly? You want to preserve the information that is valuable to you. Or another objection, since the Gospels are clearly theological, they're written to commend Christianity, they're written to try to convince people that Jesus was the divine Son of God. What if that Today we might say ideological commitment. Overly biased, and therefore they skew the truth. Shoot, I mean, is there a politician? Oh, don't go there, my brother. We live in an age where people just make up flat out lies, and people come to their defense and think they're telling the truth. But before we get too cynical, we also recognize that there are times in the history of the world when someone is passionately committed to a cause in a way that requires them to tell the story carefully and accurately. One of the best examples of the last 100 years was after the Nazi regime fell, after the Holocaust, after the end of World War II, when it was Jewish historians, practicing Jewish historians, passionately committed that something like this never happened to their people again or any other people, were the ones who chronicled the lives and deaths to the best of their ability of 6 million Jews killed by the Third Reich. If I am telling a story about a man, no one doubted that he was a human being, who was, as far as anyone could see, raised, went through all the stages of human development like any other man, that somehow he was also God, and this coming out of the most rigidly monotheistic culture of the day, one God and one God only, that's pushing a rock uphill. That's an uphill battle. And then he was resurrected from the dead, and we saw him work miracles with people who never were convinced by those stories, still alive, eager to disabuse Christian speakers of their claims if they knew they were telling falsehoods. No, there is good reason to think that gospel writers intended to write history. But could they do it? Could they pull it off? Aren't the four Gospels like that magnet I have on my refrigerator? Four very different versions, especially the Gospel of John. Yeah, they are, and there are reasons for those differences. But let's not overlook the fact that this was an era. Some scholars have spoken of the guarded tradition, others speak about memorization. In an oral culture where the majority of people could not read or write, not that they were dumb, they just learned in different ways. People were trained with all kinds of mnemonic devices to memorize and recite and repeat and remember large amounts of information that would put most of us to shame because we never cultivate those practices since we have retrievability of print. We also can look at a literary relationship among especially the first three Gospels, the so-called Synoptic Gospels. A theory that in its classic form goes back to an Englishman by the name of Burton Hillman Streeter in 1924, 101 years ago. That Mark was the oldest and first Gospel written, that Matthew and Luke both knew his wording, repeated, they even copied large amounts of Mark, that they had access to another source that a group of German scholars called Q, which stands for the German word Quelle, which excitingly means source. No James Bond Q here, I'm afraid. And most of the 235 verses are sayings of Jesus or parts of parables or discourses It seems that there may have been a source that collected what today would be a DVD, and we call it The Best of Jesus. That Matthew and Luke also relied on. And then there are verses that are unique to Matthew and Luke, which I've simply labeled as others do in now. So memorization was one of the factors going on, but a literary relationship, knowing what one another had written, was going on. And then what has been called informal control tradition. Before an epic saga of a group of people was formally written down in its entirety, storytellers had an amount of freedom. They may have had a version entirely memorized, but on any given occasion, when a small community, often in a village, would gather, they would recite certain parts of it, but not all of it, that were relevant to the occasion. They would paraphrase, they would abbreviate, they would expand again, they would explain things. We find that going on all over the place when you compare the Gospels. And then there's a fascinating area of study that's the most recent, probably only in the last 30 years has really come into its own, called social memory. What is the impact of very rarely having a single Christian address a group of people in public without at least one companion with him or her? In a world that had nothing corresponding to our degrees of courtesy or politeness, if I'm with Joe and he misspoke, I not only have the right, I have the responsibility to publicly correct him so that people aren't misled. Imagine the 12 traveling with Jesus, better part of 3 years, even just around Galilee, which according to the first century Jewish historian Josephus had 204 small villages in it. And Matthew says Jesus went to them all. Well, maybe it's a bit of hyperbole. Let's say he only made 183. I don't know. Just pick a number. Did he have a different message with different stories and different illustrations every time? I doubt it. No other person in the history of the world is an itinerant speaker who did that. How many times would the disciples have heard the same teachings and accounts? And then they're sent out on their own mission, 2 by 2, to replicate Jesus' ministry, all before Jesus even dies, while he's still alive. Are they not going to be remarkably well prepared to continue doing that after his death? Well, Craig, somebody says, you brought a Bible with you, but you really haven't used it yet, except just kind of wave it around. I'm sorry, allow me to rectify that. Although, you can also see it on the screen. Screens. What do the gospel writers themselves think they would do? Luke gives us the most detailed answer to that right at the very beginning of his gospel. Many have undertaken to draw an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. How many is many? Normally, in ancient Greek, like in modern English, it means more than 2. The 3, 4. I don't know how many more. It doesn't say they're all narratives as detailed as the ones we have in the New Testament. Maybe something like few was one of them. Maybe somebody collected a group of their most favorite parables of Jesus. Maybe somebody else collected and wrote down a group of his miracles. But there were enough people who had already started this task, and might some of them have provided a source for the 2nd and 3rd century Christian Apocrypha with some of its more fanciful stories about Jesus? That Luke felt a need to, for anybody who might be confused, set the story straight. And so the account was what was handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Luke himself has carefully investigated everything from the beginning. He decided to write an orderly account for a man who presumably was his patron, because this involved a lot of travel, a lot of research, a lot of papyrus or parchment, which was costly, the ink to go with it. If Luke wasn't a trained writer, he may have had to hire a scribe to dictate the gospel to. And it's in opening prologues like this where ancient historians and biographers name their patrons if they had them. Somebody who apparently was not a plebeian, maybe not in the Senate or in the highest echelons of the Roman government, but well enough to do that he is called most excellent, Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you've been taught. Again, this doesn't prove that Luke did it flawlessly, but it does tell us what he was trying very hard to do. Then come a couple of points that are a little different. What some people have called the hard sayings of Jesus. No, not hard to obey, that would be most of them. But the hard sayings, and that if someone felt free to leave something out or reword it grammatically, then why did they even leave it in the way it is? Like, you have to hate your father and mother, brother and sister. Can I have a show? No, I won't ask. I don't know what families you come from. Fortunately, there is a story, an account in Matthew 10 of Jesus teaching similarly when he says, whoever does not love God far more, or their father, brother, and sisters is not worthy of me. I mean, that's hard enough if you come from a good family, or if you're a parent and have a great family. But surely it would have been easier just to leave that out. Apparently Luke didn't feel free to do so. Or in talking about the end of the world, not even the Son, not even Jesus, and the voluntarily adopted limitations of his incarnation knew the day or hour of his return. Oh, don't admit that. You're trying to build Jesus up as a God-man for the sake of the pagans who need him. Just leave it out, but it's there in all three synoptic gospels. And then there are what some people call missing sayings. I think that's a little misleading, so I've called them missing topics. But things that were of huge controversy in the first generation of Christianity, when we know a writer like the Apostle Paul would quote or allude to something that Jesus taught when he had become aware of it. But not when you're talking about the circumcision of an adult Greek or Roman male who did not have the tradition of baptism, right? That's what we do. As a baby and having this rite performed on him in a world without anesthesia. Well, I suppose you could have a stiff drink, and they did have opium, but not quite the same. This is where the idea of God-fearers that Acts talks about came from. People who were attracted to Yahweh, God of Israel, who went to the synagogue, who obeyed the Ten Commandments, who practiced the laws of Moses, but if they were men, there was one they stopped short of. And so they weren't full-fledged proselytes or converts to Judaism. Paul starts teaching that neither circumcision nor uncircumcision is anything but faith working through love, Galatians 5:6. Whoa, that's radical. The Jewish Christians back in Jerusalem didn't all agree. They got together and had a big powwow, a big council in Acts 15 to settle it. And fortunately for those grown men who were Gentiles, they said, no, you don't have to be circumcised to be saved. Phew, a lot of sighs of relief being expressed. But why not just quote Jesus? He was the authority that would have settled it. What did Jesus say on the topic? Ask around, not a person's sight. Remember, anybody ever telling him that they heard Jesus said anything on the topic? And nobody felt free just to invent something, put it in the tradition, for the sake of making a decision easy. You can say the same thing about speaking in tongues, which threatened to divide the church in Corinth considerably. What did Jesus think? Paul has already alluded to what Jesus taught on divorce, about what he has taught on making money for ministry, about what he has taught on marriage, remarriage, celibacy, several other topics in 1 Corinthians alone. Why in 3 chapters, 12 through 14, that all have something to do with this topic, does Paul not cite a word that Jesus said about speaking in tongues? Is that what settled the controversy? Apparently he never said anything. And nobody felt free to invent it. We're coming down the home stretch. We'll be happy here. There are some folks who say or think, oh, that's all very interesting. Or maybe they don't think it's interesting. But what really counts is what did non-Christians in the earliest centuries of the Christian movement, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century, and a little bit later, have to say about Jesus. And you can find all kinds of websites that have the fictitious claim that Jesus never existed. It's bonkers. It's baloney. It's other things that start with B that have 2 syllables. Ball game. I don't know what that means. There are references twice in the 1st century Jewish historian Josephus. There are at least a half a dozen texts in that encyclopedic-sized collection of Jewish traditions that was later written down in something called the Talmud. In Greek, writers like Lucian and Mara ben Serapion, and Roman authors Thallus, Suetonius, Tacitus, and Pliny. They all talked about Jesus. What did they say? Well, so that I don't bore you and repeat things, let me just give you a composite of what we can get from one or more of these authors. Not one of whom ever became a Christian or claimed to be. Jesus certainly was a Jewish man who lived in the 1st third of the 1st century, as we would call it today. He was born out of wedlock. He didn't believe the story of the virgin birth. A Roman soldier raping Mary was the next most likely tradition. He had dealings with a relative by the name of John, who baptized people for the repentance of sin, and therefore became known as John the Baptizer. He had a brother named James, As a young adult, he gathered disciples around him at an itinerant public ministry. 5 of the disciples are named, although the names are a little garbled. He frequently taught interpretations of the laws of Moses that riled up the Jewish religious leaders in Israel. He worked what Josephus calls wondrous feats, something like miracles. Nobody knew quite how to make sense of them. People began to think he might be the Messiah. And eventually, because of his controversial teaching, he was arrested, executed, sentenced and executed under Pontius Pilate, governor of Judea, which means we can date that period to somewhere between 26 and 36, is when Pilate ruled in Judea. And yet, people claimed to see him alive after his death, and his movement didn't die out like so many other Messianic pretenders' movements had done, but it continued to grow so that soon on a weekly basis they were gathering, and as Pliny, the Roman governor in the late 1st century, put it, singing hymns to Jesus as if he were a god. Interesting collection of testimony. Actually about what you might expect at a time when nobody ever anticipated Jesus being the founder of what would one day be the world's largest religion in terms of numbers of adherents. Especially when you realize that most ancient history and biography was written about kings and queens and military generals and the nobility and people in official positions of power and authority in society, not just average, ordinary folks, which is what Jesus was if you went by his credentials. For some people, they want rock-hard evidence, the evidence of the rocks, archaeological discoveries. Entire books have been written on this topic. It's hard to know what to pick. But things that have been found just in my lifetime. Okay, that's a little bit longer than the pools that John's Gospel describes on the north and southern sides of the Temple Mount called Bethesda and Siloam. An inscription testifying to Pilate as the prefect of Judea during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. A small coffin or bone box of a crucified Jewish man by the name of Johannan somewhere in Galilee, where we actually found part of an ankle bone nailed to a piece of wood the first time we had proof that the ankles as well as the wrists were nailed rather than just roped to a cross. 1986, the first time I had the privilege of going to Israel, was within months of when they discovered a 1st century boat, enough pieces of wood still somewhat intact that they were able to painstakingly preserve and reconstruct it. And you can now go and for a good sum of money, quite reasonable, see the Jesus boat. Nobody knows whose boat it is, but the Israeli authorities know how to bring in tourist shekels. And it is a 1st century boat, large enough to hold 13 small men, bigger than anything we knew existed previously. You want to think of it as Jesus? I guess there's no harm done. The tomb of the high priest at the time of Jesus' death, Caiaphas. A small bone box of James, brother of Jesus. A 1st century home in Nazareth. The skeptics used to love to say, we know Nazareth was settled in the 2nd century BC, and we know it was settled in the 3rd century AD. We have no evidence of any building in between. How do you think it got from A to B? when the amount that exists is so spare to begin with. Okay, now we found some first century foundation stones. Go shut up. I'm sorry. Back in Israel, where they don't have political correctness. And much, much more. But I want to end pretty close to on time with testimony from another part of the New Testament. It might seem a strange place to end. If you were thinking these were arguments ascending in climactic order, I didn't really end them that way. Paul, in the longest sustained discussion of the resurrection of Jesus in the Bible, writes, for what I received. For I received what I passed on to you, and those two verbs in Greek and Hebrew does the same thing. When they are used in this kind of context, in a pairing, often refer to the careful passing on of memorized oral tradition. What I pass on to you as of first importance, if you have a Bible with footnotes, it's the NIV has a footnote here, and it says, or at the first. And what follows is very much a tightly packed, condensed doctrinal statement about Jesus' death and burial and resurrection and the witnesses to the resurrection that many scholars, not all Christians, suspect is a very early Christian creed or confession of faith. That therefore, if Paul realized it was one of the first things he needed to teach people, because it was of great importance, may have been one of the first things he was taught as a new believer after Saul of Tarsus had his experience on the Damascus Road. And that we can date to within about 2, maybe 3 years at the most of Jesus' death. This is not some slowly evolving late myth that took the simple Jewish rabbi and eventually turned him into a pagan god. This is right at the very heart of the Christian faith from earliest days on. It's what all the speakers in the book of Acts from Pentecost are focusing on, is the resurrection of Jesus. My conclusion, therefore, is there are at least 3 kinds of Christian faith. And I take my analogy from track and field. Anybody here a long jumper? Nope. Oh well. I hardly need them. I love watching it on TV though. Running down that track, and then you gotta commit so that you don't fall a little stripe and you jump. How far in the sand can you go? There are people in the modern world that talk about a leap that is absurd, a leap of faith that is not only without evidence, but goes against all rational evidence. And I suppose it's like if you could imagine somebody running down that track and then wheeling to a stop, screeching, and suddenly putting every joint out of joint by trying to hurl themselves back in the direction from which they came. Never seen anybody try it. Hope I never do. But I'm sure you could produce a cartoon that would be wonderful. Faith in spite of all the evidence. No, that doesn't seem to be accurate. Another group of people, maybe larger than the first, and some of them in Christian circles. If you've ever been to the Denver Zoo, there's an illustration there. You go to a place and tell a little kid, here's the line, stay behind it, don't run, don't walk, just stand there, swing your arms, get ready and see how far you can jump, and then there's a mural. You can see which animal you jumped about as far as. In other words, faith doesn't produce any momentum evidence doesn't produce any momentum for or against faith. You just decide, am I going to have a leap of faith? No, I would like to suggest that what we see as the standard long jump, but it's actually a short jump compared to those others, is what we see modeled in historical study, scriptures in general, particularly the lives of Jesus in the gospel. There is no way we will ever prove historically every detail. If we ever could have, that evidence is long since gone. Don't ever believe anyone who tells you you can have 100% certainty. But then don't ever look for it either. Did you check for a car bomb before you drove today if you had a car? I didn't. I've never had any reason to, but if I were in Israel, I would be checking daily. There are so many things we do completely on faith. But it's faith based on evidence. I am tired and I slam myself down in the chair. I didn't check to make sure it was screwed on tightly. And never once has it let me down. The only times I've fallen off chairs are when I was already sitting on them. But that's another story. We can't have 100% certainty, but we don't need it because life is based on what is the most highly likely probability, and we act on it all the time. Let's see, it's not time for me to put my hat back on yet because you're going to have some questions. So come and lead us into all truth, or at least in the next segment of the evening.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Blomberg. Wow. We are. So we're going to move to some opportunity for you guys to ask questions. With this in mind, I want to make sure, first of all, don't turn it into your own little speech with a little bit of like, oh, I just gave my sermon, what do you think of that at the end of it? But actually some poignant questions with this. This is a great opportunity. Maybe you're a skeptic. Maybe you're here and you're like, I'm not a Christian. I don't believe in this whole thing, but now I have some questions from what you brought up today. This is a great opportunity to ask those questions. Or if you have a friend that has brought up questions that you just like, I don't know necessarily how I respond. This is an opportunity for you to ask those questions. We were hoping to have a little handheld mic that I was just going to kind of go around. But without that and realizing it's quite easy to be heard in here, I think we'll just kind of do the classroom style, raise your hand. The doctor will call it on you as he sees fit. And just make sure, if you ask a question and maybe something's not quite fitting what you were asking, maybe a one follow-up question or something like that. But we don't want one person to be dominating the Q&A. Not saying that you won't be able to have multiple questions, but maybe leave room for one or two people in between yours if you have a stack of questions that you want to ask. We're going to leave a good fair amount of time to get into a lot of those. But we want to make sure that everybody has a chance to kind of at least ask one question if they already have something burning on their mind. So,
Would you be willing to call on people so I can confuse my bias or
sure.
not
Yes.
seeing somebody with
Yeah, I could do that as well. So yeah, if you have a question, raise your hand. I'll kind of call on people as we go. Anybody? I'll even just say prime as you think. I'll start with one question myself. One of the things from my seminary school studying is I studied a little bit of what David Allen Black writes about, throwing out the idea that Matthew was actually written first. And that seemed to be largely from early church fathers seeing what I understood, all of them attesting that Matthew is written first. You seem to have the view that Mark is written first. How do you see that?
David is a great guy, and he has made a career of defending a number of views on Bible-related questions that the majority of scholars disagree with him on. Nothing that affects basic tenets of the faith. That's one of them. If you are totally bored with life someday, and you want to recover some zest for your regular commitments, I'll give you the foolproof method. Find a synopsis of the Gospels that prints parallel text in parallel columns, and start with page 1, and every time there's a passage that appears in more than 2 Gospels, take a highlighter of your preferred color and underline every word that's verbatim the same. Then go back in a different color, pick those that are the same word but just a different form of the word, maybe a different tense, a verb. Then maybe in a third color, underline words that aren't the same but they're synonyms. And then start asking yourself, do I see patterns here? Now, maybe it has something to do with that being a common doctoral assignment for people specializing in the Gospels, but it really does very quickly make everything else in life seem joyful. But if you persevere, you do begin to see patterns, and you see things like Mark tends to have the most rugged Greek style that Matthew and Luke regularly smooth out. Mark, although he's the shortest by far of the 4 Gospels, typically has the longest passage when there's a passage that appears also in Matthew or Luke, as if Matthew and Luke are deliberately compressing them in order to leave more space for completely different stories altogether. You'll discover signs of what are called Aramaisms, but also Latinisms, things that look like they're translated pretty literally, even awkwardly from Aramaic, but also things that fit the fact that Mark, following Peter, was writing the church in and around Rome, according to ancient tradition in the early 60s. You can put together 8 or 10 of these tendencies, and it's like, if this were any other triad documents, and you had reason to believe there was a literary relationship, you would say this one is first. So what do we do with the early church testimony? And it's not like we have thousands of manuscripts. There are 3 or 4 key witnesses. It probably is because Matthew was put first, leading to the assumption that he was written first, when in fact he was probably placed first because he had the greatest number of tie-ins with what the Christians started to call the Old Testament, what was already the existing Hebrew Scripture. So David is a friend. I respect him, but he's in a tiny minority on that issue. And he could be right. Respect.
I have a question. You talked about missing topics in scripture,
Yeah.
and why was it included. And something I've come across when talking with Jehovah's Witnesses and people like that is just this idea that Jesus never claims to be God, and that he even said, mentioned like Adam was never Alpha, or Father greater than I. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts as to why Jesus didn't have explicitly said, I know he said that I am quote, but
Right.
what was the reason?
Yeah. Don't know what would happen in your closest circle of friends. To say nothing of people in the larger CSU audience. One day you started going around saying, "Hi, I'm God." every claim that we see attributed to Jesus comes with a certain amount of veil over it, a certain amount of potential double meaning. Yes, he is walking on the water. And if one of the disciples had said, "Oh my God," that would have been appropriate. But ego eimi in the Greek translation of whatever Jesus spoke in Aramaic can also mean "I am he." Well, which is it? Can I nail down one as opposed to another? I and the Father are one. Yeah, I'm one with my wife, but that doesn't make me ontologically, essentially the same being in a different person as my wife. People recognize Jesus as the Messiah and say, "Shut up, don't tell me." That's a paraphrase. Because no one was prepared to yet understand the terminology the way he was intending it. And the last time in Mark 9:9, chronologically, when he silences somebody, Mark adds that they should say nothing until after the resurrection. Then it would be clear that he was not the military, regal, rebellion leader, revolutionary incendiary that was going to lead the troops against Rome. Then there can begin to be some understanding that he is not just blaspheming and doing what no Jew could ever think of doing, somehow substituting himself for God, the Father, Yahweh. But in the line that separated things you could attribute to divinity from those you could attribute to humanity, he keeps falling above the line as well as below it. Had he gone around and been any more explicit, I think people would have reacted with some combination of "he's an idiot," "he's a fool," or "you need to do away with him," before he recognized it was his hour, his time, which we read a lot about in this case. Great question.
In Matthew 2:23, it says, "When he came and dwelt in the city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled what was spoken by the prophets, and shall be called a Nazarene." And one of my friends had a question, where's this not in Scripture? Wasn't there? Funny enough, I just asked the AI to tell me if I was missing it, and it actually cited what you wrote.
Ooh, that's spooky.
Yeah.
So what did I write?
Kind of your commentary on what that means, how it.
So what did it say? I got to find out if you got it right.
Well, just use it as a source. So you get two interpretations where Nazareth is either a play on words or kind of using Nazareth as Jesus' humble beginnings and how the other scriptures in Isaiah lead to that.
That's good, because the first time I checked AI, I didn't have my birthday right, so I keep getting a little worried. So the Hebrew term mixer, the three consonants, MZR with the short E in between, was a word that could mean prince. It has been taken as an allusion back to Isaiah 11, where the branch of Jesse is the one who is going to become the royal prince who becomes King David. It has been taken as, I suppose we might today say, oh, he's just somebody from Hicksville. growing up in, or at least living part of my young adult life in Chicagoland, there were people who like to talk about, oh, he's just from Westover, Nebraska, but there might be somebody here from Westover, Nebraska, or its equivalent, so I don't want to offend you. But nowhere is Bill, because in Isaiah 52 and 53, we read how he had nothing comely, nothing that we should respect him, look disfigured and so forth. The key, I think, is the fact that it's the one time in all of Matthew's Gospel when he is quoting something as fulfilling the text of Scripture, when he doesn't refer to the prophet. He refers to prophets. If you like certain works of modern fiction, you might say prophecies. How precious. Okay, so it's not one fixed text. There must be some kind of a theme that we find in the prophets. There are a few people that even try to relate it to the idea of being a Nazirite. One never shaved or had his haircut or took strong drink. That's a little harder to derive etymologically from the Hebrew, but that's been suggested. So, yeah, you don't have to worry that you really don't know your Old Testament as well as you thought you did. You don't have to start looking in the Apocrypha. You won't find it there either.
Any other ones? I'm sure there's a couple more questions.
So I've heard one.
Really quick.
Guy with the best cowboy hat. I love it.
Thank you very much.
Anybody not get the computer for the survey that wanted to fill that out? Just a little survey to kind of get an idea for future events. This road here. Okay. Awesome.
Yes, sir.
Appreciate the compliment.
I mean, the competition is kind of, well.
So I've heard this one actually a couple times, and even based on your presentation, I think it's really dubious, and I personally thought it's pretty dubious. But have you heard the idea that much of the gospel story was a invented narrative from Constantine era Roman authorities to kind of push Christianity as a cultural movement within Rome?
Yeah, it doesn't work because we have several dozen second century manuscripts and early 3rd century. We have several more dozen. Constantine is in the 320s, which is early 4th century. So these stories have already been circulating, written down, and copied by many, many people before Constantine was ever born. Other than that, it's...
The other ones. Doesn't necessarily even have to be probably the topic tonight. It could even just be kind of a New Testament question.
Oh.
Maybe broaden it out a little bit.
Maybe.
It's not very big, so I apologize in advance. We're studying Mark, our study. There's a lot of early Christians. There's a lot of early Mark at once. What would you say to someone who's wondering, how do I know when it's hyperbolic and when it's not?
Great question. The obvious ones are when it doesn't make any sense when you take it literally. If you lust, pluck out your eye. Okay, here's a dangerous experiment. Everybody close your eyes. Can you still lust? Okay, stop it. Yeah, it would work. So it can't be meant literally. My mother told me 1,000,000 times never to exaggerate. That's not the Bible. I suppose if you did the math, that's all she said all day long, for how many years? I don't know, I've never tried it. Could it theoretically be possible? Well, if I said my mother told me 1,000 times, that could be possible. I mean, she only needed to say it once a day for a little over 3 years or so. But is it likely, in terms of what people normally do, or even somewhat abnormally do? It might be just conceivable. Immediately, you thirst. Mark has it over 100 times. No other gospel has more than 50. And if every time you took immediately, and you assumed it means at least, let's say on the same day, you would have two huge problems. One, the gospels would contradict each other all over the place. And two, the ministry of Jesus would be over in 3 months. John says it was at least 3 years. So that's a literary device. Other people in the time did it also. It's a way of creating vividness, but also a rapid-paced, action-packed narrative. One of the best ways I think of making sense of the Gospels is thinking about movies. I like action movies. I like mysteries. I've seen a lot of those shows where the hero has got 10 minutes before the bomb explodes, and you watch the numbers clicking down, and then with 1/10 of a second left, like the Nuggets dunk. I see why the Clippers were upset. I watched that replay a few times, and I'm glad it went for us. The bomb is diffused, and I checked my watch. Those 10 minutes took 20 minutes of airtime. How did they do that? But then, sometimes we're told of something on the screen 15 years later. Sometimes we're not. We just have to infer it. Ancient biographies were like that. You talked about what was important for the reasons that you were writing the story. And you left other things out, and you skipped over large amounts of time in no time flat, and you slowed way down at other times. Every time you see words in English translations like "at that time," "then," "now," "immediately," "at once," it might mean that, and it might mean now the point of this is, oh, that wasn't a chronological now, right? What we're saying then, oh, it's a logical then, it's not a chronological then. If the text actually says 3 days after this, it probably means 3 days after this, but then you have to ask, were they counting inclusively or exclusively? Does 3 days mean Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or is 3 days from now Thursday? And they can do it both ways. But that's not the way we do things. Yeah, they weren't us. Writing at different time, very different levels of precision. Sundial was the most accurate instrument. You didn't wear one on your wrist. Might be one in the center marketplace. I can tell by the clouds. It's 11:54. No, you can't tell that.
Maybe one or two more. We want to respect your time, so you're driving back home tonight.
It's true.
Yeah, way in the back.
Yes, thank you so much. I have a question about the age of Jesus Christ. We've had in verses where people have revelations about the date 0 BC, in the dates that Jesus was born.
Yeah.
And I believe that King Herod, who was Jesus, had died 4 years prior. So how do you
Yeah, well, first of all, there never was any zero. When people moved to that calendar, they went from 1 BC to 1 AD. They never envisioned the year zero. But the problem was that that whole calendar only started to slightly become popular in the 6th century. And it was several more centuries before it caught on in most of what we would call the Western world, and it took much longer before the East Asian countries even knew that people were using that, much less that they started using it. And the monk by the name of Dionysius Exiguus, who did all the research, didn't bother to look at Josephus, which gives the best and most detailed information about when Herod the Great died. And by the time his calendar had been adopted, at least in Italy, Greece, and a few places, it was like, oops. You know Herod died before BC? We got a problem. Herod died 4 years before the Christ child was born, that he persecuted when he had been up to the age of 2 at the old child. And so it was too late to change it, and that's what we're stuck with. But it actually helps chronologically a number of issues, because we have a series of Egyptian censuses ordered by Rome that we can date and see that they were on an every 13-year cycle. We don't know if that was the same cycle as applied to the rest of the Roman Empire. We don't know if it was at the same time. But just for mathematical fun, let's imagine that it was. We know there was a census under Judas the Galilean in AD 6. Now let's go back 13 years, no year zero, you get to BC 7. Okay, the order goes out in Rome for a census. And immediately everybody gets on their computer and responds, no. You have a select number of people who by foot or by boat travel and try to canvass slowly, tediously, every village in the empire. It could easily have been 6 or 5 or 4 BC before they got to the hinterlands out east in Israel and Bethlehem. And actually, let's suppose it was only 6 BC. That could explain why Herod had all the babies killed up to the age of 2. He had no real clue at all when this Christ child was born. We don't know when the Magi left, wherever they left, probably Persia, maybe Arabia. Doesn't say that the star appeared the day Jesus was born. It doesn't say if it did, that they decided to leave on that day. In fact, if you look at Matthew 2 carefully, the only time the star is ever said to move is to guide the wise men from Jerusalem, the 5 miles south of Bethlehem. The rest of the time, they're just looking at it as a spot in the sky. In the east? No, it can't have been in the east, not if you're in Persia or Arabia. It had to be in the west. They saw when they were in the east. The star, they did not see the star in the east. Come to seminary, learn some Greek. It's wonderful. Or keep asking great questions.
Okay, one more. We'll finish on this last one. Anybody's got it?
But no question.
Yeah.
Sure.
We got 2 minutes right now.
I'll be real fast.
Good. Go ahead.
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned something really briefly earlier. I think when you were talking about Mark, about church tradition. I'm just really curious, like where do we draw the line in using church tradition to, find the different, origins for these gospels or for the validity of the gospels or any other church doctrines? Because church tradition is often cited so often within certain denominations for certain things.
Want to know something that is not answered in the Bible, then the logical thing to do is go to its earliest known interpreters. And don't assume they're always right. Weigh it, see if it makes sense, see if it's independently attested in multiple sources. And every now and then you find something that is somewhat fanciful. And every now and then you find stuff that is disputed. 3 different church fathers say 3 different things. But when you have several people all agreeing and there isn't some compelling reason not to believe it, then it probably makes sense to believe it.
I guess maybe sure. So I'm going to say, hermeneutics, and basically what that is. What would you say kind of are the main tenets of interpreting scripture the way that it was intended to be read rather than dragging it somewhere else and taking it completely off?
I do this at school. I try to do it as large as I can. And I say, if in 50 years, as the first signs of dementia are setting in, somebody wakes you up at 3 in the morning and says, what is the single most important word and principle for interpreting a passage in Scripture? The answer will still be context. It is wonderful in the history of the church. People have learned many Bible verses. It is appalling that most of them they've never learned in context. I can do all things in Christ who strengthens me. No, you can't. I dreamed of being able to dunk a basketball when I was growing up. And to my friends who had big jeans in the back row, I was saddled with white man's disease. I couldn't jump. That statement will never be true as long as I live. And then I hurt my knee playing basketball at age 19, and I waited 47 years in order to get a knee replacement without a medial meniscus or an ACL. So I really couldn't do it then. Yeah, interpreting context, historical context, social context, political context, literary context, what comes before, what comes after. How is the narrative of the gospel, how does it unfold? Can we make informed guesses as to an outline or a structure? There are wonderful websites. If you Google something like most abused Bible verses. I have plans not to harm you, says Jeremiah. Do good things for you. Yeah, he told that to the Babylonian captives, so within 40 years they would be rescued. That does not mean what everybody uses it to mean. Where 2 or 3 are gathered together, there I am in the midst of all. Yes, it's true. Jesus is omnipresent as a spirit. And if you're gathered together with yourself, he's there. And if nobody's in the room, he's there. So that is a true statement. But read Matthew 18, read it in context. It's about following properly instructed church discipline. And when you do that, God and Jesus are in accord with what we do. Church discipline? What's that? Nobody does that. Well, that's another story. You ought to read it and start doing it. Kindly. Not like the Spanish Inquisition. I know they're great on all times. Catch.
Well done. All right, well, we're gonna end there. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you all for coming tonight. This was an honor to be able to put this together. Hopefully, we can keep you informed of things that we might do in the future. Feel free to reach out to me. I'll likely try to send some emails to everyone just so I can know any ways that we can connect with you, ways that we can serve you as what we do as a ministry. I'm going to end the night with prayer. Probably should have opened the night with that. But I think that is definitely the way to finish it. So, Father, I thank you for tonight. I thank you for just the giftings that you give to different people, to equip us as saints, to go out and to share your word, to challenge and strengthen us in our walk, in our faith. We thank you that this is a faith that is undergirded by evidence, that it is not a standing jump or a backward jump, but it is a running jump that isn't very large. God, I pray that you would just allow this to be something that we are then going out to share with others. Let this be something that changes and affects us throughout the rest of our lives, and not just a one-off time of learning something more, but we would apply and use this in our lives. For that in Jesus' name, amen. Thank you all.